Thank you, everybody, for attending today's webinar, Better Buildings for Everyone, Federal Funding and Financing a Building Performance Standard, also known as BPS. We're going to drop in soon a poll just to get a better understanding from folks who is all here. We just want to know what industry you are in. So just take a quick 5 to 10 seconds to answer that. And as we begin today on our webinar, I don't want to assume that everybody knows what a BPS is. I know a lot of you who are on today's call are familiar with building performance standards, but again, a BPS is a policy that sets standards that's designed to reduce carbon emissions in buildings by improving energy, gas and water usage, and peak demand. So our speakers today and our audience, you guys are the ones in the room who are changing the landscape when it comes to equitable BPS. So as always, thank you again to our audience, our speakers, for your passion, your commitment on not just BPS, but also in working collaboration, partnership together on mitigating the biggest risk to our planet, which is climate change. All right, so my name is Rajiv Ravalapati. I am with IMT, the Institute for Market Transformation. I'm their senior manager for government engagement. So there's a lot of government folks here that I've had conversations with in regards to a BPS. So good to see you. And if you haven't, I'll be talking to you soon. And I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri. And today we're going to be talking about the federal perspective of financing and funding a BPS from the federal, state, and local perspective. And from the federal perspective, we've got Maggie Molina. Maggie is with the Environmental Protection Agency, where she is the state and local climate and energy program branch supervisor, and Maggie's based in DC. And then her other DC colleague who will be talking about the state perspective about funding opportunities for BPS is Ed Carley. Ed is the senior program director for buildings for NASIO, which is the National Association of State Energy Officials. And then last but not least, we've got the local perspective, Sharon J. Sharon is the Building Performance Policy Manager. She's based in Denver, Colorado. And before working for the city of Denver, she's been there for about 1.5 years. She was very instrumental in the design and passage of the BPS policy in DC, where she once worked, which was the very first BPS policy passed in the country in 2019. So today is the third webinar in our ongoing BPS webinar series. If you had attended in the past, you know we've had one about BPS implementation from a high level back in January. We focused on high performance building hubs back in March. And today, again, we're talking about federal funding and financing of BPS. And we've got our fourth webinar series, which will be scheduled and coming out later in June. And that's talking about the legal pathways for a BPS. One thing to note is that we cover this topic, BPS, in great length. We've got a great IMT resource called the BPS Implementation Guide, 90 pages to be exact, but that's something that we'll share as a follow-up to our participants today. And it's also, I want to be able to emphasize one thing is that this work that we do on BPS, the education, the working with stakeholders, working with governments, it's a constant process. It's very fluid. So with your feedback, we're always looking to hear on what are more topics that are more salient for you and your community and your government. And also just hearing your feedback to help facilitate those conversations and improving the living documents that we have here at IMT that we use to talk about and educate stakeholders on BPS. So before I hand it off to our speakers, this is the webinar agenda, and I'm going to go over some quick housekeeping rules for today's webinar. So again, we're going to be talking about 3 different perspectives about funding, federal funding opportunities for BPS. We'll hear from Maggie, who will be talking about the federal actions happening from the EPA. Ed will be talking about DOE, Department of Energy funding opportunities for BPS and using specific examples. And then Sharon with Denver is going to be talking about the planning that they've been doing as a city to fund and prepare for their BPS, as well as some of the partnerships that she's put into place for going after this funding. And then with about 20 minutes left in today's webinar, we'll do a Q&A with our audience. So I see many of you are already active in the chat. So if you can hold most of your questions for a Q&A section, that would be great. But if you've got questions that are really burning for you, please drop them in the chat. And we've got two colleagues of ours, Amy Boyce and Cliff Majerzik, who will be able to answer them on the go. But I'll also call them out when we actually get to the Q&A section. So with that said, let's get the show on the road. So first up, like I said, is Maggie Molina with the EPA. One quick thing to note is that we are recording this webinar today, so we'll send it after today's call, but the slides that Maggie has shared today will not be part of our PDF summary when we send this up after the webinar. So that said, I'm going to hand it to Maggie.
Great. Thank you so much, Rajiv, and good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate the invitation from IMT to be here, and I'm happy to have this time with you all to share some updates on some really exciting climate and environmental justice funding opportunities from EPA, as well as technical assistance opportunities under the Inflation Reduction Act. So going to the agenda today, I'd like to share 3 EPA funding opportunities under the Inflation Reduction Act. The first, the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, or CPRG, the planning grants aspect of that, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and third, the Climate Environmental Justice and Communities Grants Program. So my colleagues in various offices across the agency are working really hard on these exciting new programs under the IRA, and I'm really happy to share updates on each of those. And then finally, I'd like to wrap up with some technical assistance resources through DOE and EPA for work specific to building performance standards. So first, let me just set some context. EPA has many tools in our toolkit to address climate and air pollution from multiple angles. And like I said, this is really bolstered by funding under the historic Inflation Reduction Act. So many of those programs are shown here on this slide, but this is not an exhaustive set by any means. The Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, shown in the top right there, catalyzes a top-down approach to climate action to accelerate state, tribal, local leadership in addressing climate change and environmental inequities. CPRG will be complemented by a bottom-up approach to environmental justice programs that will provide financial and technical assistance to low-income and disadvantaged communities, really amplifying the voices of underserved and overburdened Americans. Now, both of those approaches and the GHG Reduction Fund, which I'll get into, are bolstered by sector-specific programs shown in the other 2 sections of this chart, as well as multiple tax credits as well, not shown here. So you'll see that the 3 programs that I'd like to touch on today have broad objectives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while addressing environmental justice concerns. These 3 programs are not sector specific. However, I note that because the building sector represents such a significant opportunity for emissions reductions, that means improving our nation's buildings through energy efficiency, and similar programs represent really significant opportunities to reduce carbon pollution while also investing in our local economies and workforce development. So as I go through each of those 3 programs, I'll note potential areas of opportunity for work specific to buildings. So first, the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, or CPRG. This is a 2-phase, $5 billion planning and implementation program. Back in March, EPA made available the $250 million in non-competitive planning grants, another way of saying formula funding, to states, local governments, tribes, and territories for the development and expansion of strong climate pollution reduction plans. Now, for the second phase of the program, which will be later this year, EPA will make the remaining $4.6 billion in competitive implementation grants available for investment-ready measures that eligible entities will include in their plans. So there's a direct linkage to the climate planning phase of the program. So combined, the planning grants and the competitive implementation grants will support development and deployment of technologies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other harmful pollution. EPA is also asking participants in this program to prioritize environmental justice efforts that support low-income and disadvantaged communities, giving these communities a seat at the table and an opportunity to develop sustainable solutions. So while I don't have information yet on the implementation grants, because that part of the program is just still under development, I'd like to next share a little more about the planning grants, which can be a nice opportunity for jurisdictions doing work on buildings programs and policies such as BPS to incorporate this work into your state and your metro area's climate planning process. So here are the planning grant allocations. Each participating state, shown on the upper left there, will receive $3 million, and each participating metropolitan statistical area, or MSA, will receive $1 million to develop a metro regional climate plan. And then $25 million is set aside for tribes and $2 million for the remaining territories that aren't covered under the state allocation. So a bit more about the planning grant process. States and metro areas had different deadlines this spring to opt into the program. And the great news is that nearly all submitted their notices of intent to participate. Some of the state funding allocation shifted to the metropolitan area compared to the initial presumptive allocations I showed on the prior slide. So the number of MSAs increased to 79. So combining both the state and the metro areas, we have representation covered in all states in the program. I've included a link down here, and I think it dropped in the chat already as well. Thank you for that. Where you can get more information about the specific jurisdictions and the specific agencies that submitted their notice to participate in this program. You'll see that states, for example, in general, environmental agencies submitted their intent as a lead agency for the program. And then next on the timeline, EPA will review and process all of those applications and expects to award those funds by the summer. We know this is a quick pace that really reflects the urgency for action that climate change demands and our goal of putting this money to work as quickly as possible. And then later this year, as I think I said, EPA plans to issue a notice of funding opportunity for the implementation grant competition. And we anticipate applications for that phase will be due in the first quarter of 2024. So planning grant participants will need to complete first a priority climate action plan, or a PCAP, due in March of 2024. Those will be focused on high priority implementation ready strategies. It can draw on existing climate plans, but it's also an opportunity to update or curate strategies in those climate plans. The second deliverable will be the Comprehensive Climate Action Plan, or CCAP, due in 2025, and then last, status report. So what can the planning grant funds be used for? Staffing or contract work to inventory and analyze emissions, to assess state needs or new resource opportunities across multiple funding streams, and to run robust stakeholder engagement processes, which are a central feature of this program. So again, tying this work to the work you all are doing on BPS, climate planning grants are an opportunity for jurisdictions to update or add climate actions in their plans for the building sector, including building sector programs and policies such as building performance standards. These are flexible planning resources. It can help jurisdictions leverage a suite of federal funding opportunities. And I will hear about DOE programs as well today, and there are other opportunities. So flexible planning resources like this can give some time to look and plan around those different funding streams and to develop new state and local laws and policies to maximize pollution reduction. One final point I wanted to make here on CPRG, just before we wrap up, was about partnerships, because although each jurisdiction will have a lead organization, each of the deliverables needs to be developed in coordination with other applicable agencies within the jurisdiction. So for example, states will also need to work with municipalities to identify measures in that PCAP, the first phase, that these entities could then apply for funding under the implementation grants competition. So basically, partnerships are a key component of success of this program, and the program is designed to support a whole of government approach to climate action. And it's an opportunity for energy and environmental agencies and other departments to further bolster those partnerships. So let me go next to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. I know I'm going to cover a lot of ground here, so I'll go as quickly as I can. This is a first of its kind national program. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund will provide $27 billion in investment to mobilize financing and private capital to address climate change, promote economic competitiveness and energy independence, while also lowering energy costs and revitalizing communities that have historically been left behind. About a month ago, EPA released an implementation framework for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund that outlines expected parameters and application components for the various grant competitions, guidance on the entities eligible to receive funding, types of projects they can fund, and relevant reporting requirements. So all the information that follows in the next couple of slides is available in that implementation framework. But a quick disclaimer that EPA is not currently accepting applications for this competition. So information in the framework doesn't supersede any information in the forthcoming notice of funding opportunity announcement. So next, each of the elements of the program design is intended to further these three program objectives: reducing greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution, providing benefits to American communities, particularly low-income and disadvantaged communities, and mobilizing financing and private capital. So 3 grant competitions will be run, shown on the next slide, and the grant competitions will formally open this summer. First is a $14 billion National Clean Investment Fund in competitive grants to fund 2 to 3 national nonprofits that will partner with capital providers to deliver financing at scale. The grantees of this program will provide financial assistance and financial products. Second, a $6 billion Clean Communities Investment Accelerator to fund 2 to 7 hub nonprofits or grantees that reduce pollution in low-income and disadvantaged community in 3 priority project areas, which I'll show on the next slide. And then third, a $7 billion Solar for All competition to fund up to 60 states, territories, tribal, municipal governments, and eligible nonprofits to expand access to solar for low-income and disadvantaged communities. So let me dive a little deeper on the next slide to those first 2 shaded in blue. For the National Clean Investment Fund and the Accelerator competitions, this program has identified 3 priority project categories selected because of their particular importance to achieving those 3 program objectives. So the categories are decarbonization retrofits of existing buildings, distributed clean power generation and storage, and third, transportation pollution reduction. So like I said, existing buildings have opportunities here. So retrofits are especially critical to achieve near-term climate goals of the US. Is about, this crowd knows this well, 1/3 of all emissions today come from buildings, and that number can be as high as 70% in some cities. So competition grantees could potentially use funds to do a variety of building retrofits as laid out in the framework that I mentioned, things like deep energy retrofits and efficient electrification, grid connected appliance electrification, efficiency in multifamily housing, in schools. So projects such as these will not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also an opportunity to improve indoor air pollution. And shown on the right there is EPA suggesting that applicants consider funding projects in line with the net zero emissions buildings implementation strategy that was outlined in the executive order noted here, catalyzing clean energy industry through federal sustainability. So stay tuned for more information on our website. Again, this program is not yet accepting applications. And then the third area I wanted to cover was the Environmental and Climate Justice Communities Grant Program under the Inflation Reduction Act. So this program will provide a range of opportunities shown on the next slide, from assessment and capacity building shown on the left here to planning and pilots, all the way to full implementation shown on the right with a $2 billion Environmental and Climate Justice Change Grants program. So I don't have time to go into all these, but on the next slide, let me share a few highlights First, I wanted to mention EPA's new Environmental Justice Thriving Community Technical Assistance Centers, or TICTACs for short. This is a program in partnership with DOE that will help disadvantaged communities access and manage federal funds and conduct community engagement. 17 centers have been selected through a competitive process, and each will be provided $10 million. These centers will provide technical assistance, training related to support communities on writing grant proposals, navigating federal systems, facilitation and translation services, and some other things as well. Next, I show here the Thriving Communities Grant Making Program, which provides $500 million for grant makers to design and award EJ subgrants. And this opportunity closes on May 31st. And then third, I show here the Environmental and Climate Justice Change Grants. This is the largest program of this set at $2 billion. And this program will support implementation of a range of community-based environmental justice projects, including pollution reduction, workforce development. And those are the two that I would highlight for work you all are doing on buildings. The notice of funding opportunity is expected to open this summer, and eligible entities will be community-based organizations and partnerships that include community-based organizations. All right, so let me go to my last topic. I hope I'm not going too over here, but I wanted to make sure to mention the federal technical assistance resources that are available right now. Some of the grant updates I shared, the notices of funding opportunity aren't open yet, but technical assistance is available and accessible to you all right now. So first, the Building Performance Standard Technical Assistance Network. This is a network managed by EPA, DOE, and the national labs. And it's open to any jurisdiction exploring a BPS or a similar policy requiring building energy upgrades. I note that EPA is also available to support jurisdictions that are exploring other types of buildings initiatives, be it voluntary or other mandatory initiatives. And the network here provides support on a range of different resources, implementation tools, analysis, policy and program guidance and recommendations, and then direct tailored technical assistance and group engagement as well. So I list here a few of the implementation tools. I'm sure you all are well familiar with EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager, the Building Asset Audit Template, and then the SEED platform through the DOE as well. And then on the final slide, just a couple of more examples of the types of support we can provide under each of those categories of analysis, program policy guidance, recommendations, some specific resources. We've listed there on EPA's recommended metrics and normalization methods for a BPS toolkit, and then a guidance report as well. And then also I wanted to highlight under analysis, one thing my team is looking at is emissions and health benefits analysis. We manage tools right now for both emissions and health benefits. We're looking at how those might be helpful to you all for work on building performance standards. So if you're interested in following the upcoming series of web-based meetings under that TA network, you can contact this bps@ee.doe.gov to be added to that email list. You can also reach out directly to us at EPA with the first email listed on the top there. So with that, I think that does it for me. Just last slide here provides, again, a bunch of links that hopefully are also dropped in the chat so you can click away and get right to more information on each of these federal funding opportunities. So again, thank you so much to IMT for the opportunity to be here, and I hope I didn't go too much over my allotted time. Back to you, Rajiv.
No problem, Maggie. And thank you again for that great overview, comprehensive overview of what is currently available and what's coming down the pike. So now we're going to hear from Ed Carley about the state perspective on recent DOE opportunities. But again, right before we pass it to Ed, we've got another poll for you guys, and it's about federal funding. Have you applied for federal funding, and what has your role been? So just take another quick 5 to 10 seconds to fill that out. And for those of you who are on the webinar, please we do encourage your questions. So please do use our Q&A function here in Zoom, because we've got folks ready to stand by to be able to answer your questions. But we also understand that you may want to have them called out during our Q&A section. All right, so it looks like the big winner is right now, no, but you are interested for applying for IRA and IIJ funding. So we're going to be sending a lot of follow-up information based on today's webinar. All right, like I said, I'm going to pass it to Ed, who will talk about that state perspective on DOE funding opportunities. The floor is yours, Ed.
All right, thank you, Rajiv. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the country. So quickly, I'm Ed Carley. I'm the Senior Program Director for NASIO's Buildings Program. I want to thank IMT for inviting me. Happy to be here today. IMT asked me to come and speak to you a bit about federal funding opportunities for building performance standards and sharing some of my experience applying for funds and for reviewing applications for DOE. Quickly, NASIO is the National Association of State Energy Officials. We're the only national nonprofit for all 50 states, 5 territories in the District of Columbia and their energy offices. So typically the head of the energy office is a governor's designated appointed energy or designated energy advisor. We work on building energy efficiency, transportation, electricity, energy security, a whole variety of topics, but I'm going to keep it short since we're tight for time today. So next slide. This one. So Maggie covered the EPA program, so I'm going to focus on U.S. Department of Energy administered programs. So I'm going to refer to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act as the IIJA. You may have heard other people call it the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or BIL. It's the same thing, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, which I'll probably be calling IRA most of the day. So between these two laws, there's billions of dollars to support energy efficiency in buildings. I'm going to focus on the 2 programs that fund energy codes and building performance standards, just because this is a building performance standard focus group. So this slide is just a quick snapshot of the 2 large programs that focus specifically on these topics. So like I said, there's $1.225 billion available through both of these programs. I'm going to go into some additional detail in the next few slides, but please note that the timeline figures here are estimates. They're informed by what happened last year with the IIJA code funding and what we saw in the notice of intent from DOE to release IRA codes funding. But again, they're estimates. Don't take them as written in stone. So next slide. So the IIJA created a program called the Resilient and Efficient Codes Implementation Program, sometimes called RECI, and it's going to provide grants totaling $225 million for building energy codes and building performance standards over 5 years in tranches of $45 million per year. I think last time around, the max grants were 10 million, and I think the minimum was, I think it was $200,000. So there's kind of a pretty broad range of what you can apply for. The RECI program specifically identified building performance standards as an activity which DOE would consider funding in the December 2022 funding announcement. There might be some changes in 2023, we will see. Cities can apply for this funding, but they must do so as a part of a partnership with a state energy office, a state building code agency, or a tribal energy office. You can also have other partners, which may include community-based organizations and other building industry stakeholders. So there's a theme here that you might notice. Partnerships are a big deal. So definitely be thinking about who good partners would be. Applications for, back one still. Applications for the first round of funding through RECI closed at the end of March. They're going to announce the winners later this year. If the program does stick to the same schedule, then applications will reopen again in December. So next slide. just quickly, here are some of the activities that RECI funding, the funding opportunity announcement, sometimes we call them FOAs, identified interest in funding. So as you can see, building performance standards are specifically identified in the announcement. Again, there might be changes. There's some overlap between IRA and IIJA codes programs. The IIJ, the RECI program here was developed in part in July of last year, and then the IRA passed the next month. So they had to sort of adjust on the fly, but we'll see what happens in 2023. But we think it'll be pretty darn similar just based on the language of the legislation. So next slide, please. So the IRA is the big funding pot here. So the IRA offers $1 billion in funding for building energy codes, and DOE has decided to allow the use of these funds for building performance standards as well. So much remains to be determined about IRA codes funding, but we know that $950 million will be granted between this year and 2029. So local governments should consider approaching your state energy office to discuss partnering to use these funds to improve the energy efficiency of your local building stock, particularly if your state preempts local ability to adopt codes or things like building performance standards. As an estimate, I think that we'll know more about this program by the end of summer. It appears that any building performance standards that are funded through the IRA have to develop a plan to achieve savings equivalent to the 2021 IECC. That's for residential buildings up to 3 stories, or the 2019 edition of ASHRAE 90.1, which covers buildings 4 stories or above. That's based on the language of the statute and might be challenging. But that's what we're hearing from DOE so far. There was a notice of intent that was published in late March. There was a request for information that closed last month. And so we don't know exactly how this is going to work until DOE publishes the funding opportunity announcement. It'll be administered by the State and Community Energy Program, and SCEP, the State and Community Energy Program, is currently reviewing the responses to that request for information. And they may change their plans based on what the information they received looks like, but it's really too early to tell. So that's why we're not sure what it's going to look like yet. But the notice of intent does give a good sense. It looks like states and local governments is what DOE is considering. We can talk more about that later, but for now, that's what they're saying. So next slide. So in addition to those 2 codes programs that I just mentioned that provide funds for building performance standards, the Energy Efficiency Conservation Block Grant Program, or EECBG, allocates funds to units of local government and to state energy offices to administer programs for smaller local governments. Congress funded this program at $550 million. DOE has taken $110 million of that for unspecified technical assistance and to run competitive programs. Of the remaining $440 million, $229 million of EECBG funds will be available to eligible units of local government, and $123 million will be distributed to the state energy offices to develop statewide programs for smaller communities. NASIO has worked with some of our partners to develop programs in a box for these funds. You can find those on NASIO's website. We may have a link in the chat. I'm not positive about that. The energy offices are required to pass not less than 60% of these funds, 60% of these funds, to cities and counties that are ineligible for direct grants from DOE, and tribal governments also receive funding through EECBG. There's also a competitive funding opportunity that's currently open for local governments that were ineligible for formula funds. So that funding opportunity announcement can be found on the DOE website at the EECBG Program Competitive Funding Announcement Application Hub. I think we have a link. I can drop it in if we don't. It's at the end of my links on the Google document if you're looking for it on the back end. So that's EECBG. It's very flexible, but there are, I think, 15 specific areas that they're looking to fund. So next slide. So those are the big pots of funding that are available to local governments and state governments that focus on buildings, in addition to the programs that Maggie mentioned. So local governments should also be aware of the tax credits by the IRA. So these tax credits are entirely uncapped. So what that means is, so the Congressional Budget Office estimated IRA provides $369 billion for climate, but it's an estimate and it could be much higher if more individuals and organizations take advantage of these tax credits. So local governments with energy efficiency and renewable energy goals should really make sure that your homeowners and building owners and your communities are aware of the credits and consider designing programs to maximize compatibility with these credits. So I'm also not a tax attorney or an expert, so I'd recommend that you talk to someone who is to better understand these credits. But it's a tremendous opportunity. So next slide, please. So I wanted to have this be the meat of my presentation. Still got some time. So I was asked to share some thoughts on how to apply for funds and what reviewers will look for when they're evaluating your applications. So the bad news is applying for these DOE grants is a complicated process and it requires a significant investment of staff time. So for this reason, it's crucial to identify and work with the right partners. Coming back to that theme. So I'd encourage you to get ahead of the process by starting to achieve opportunities to accomplish your policy goals. Start having conversations about those potential partnerships with your state energy offices, your community-based organizations, your nonprofits, and other building industry stakeholders. And do that now. Do it before the application's open so that you're in place and you have a plan. You know, you don't have to have like exact specifications because you won't know what it looks like until the funding opportunity comes out, but you'll have a theme and you'll be able to sort of make progress based on how that fits in the FOA. If you don't even know where to begin to start developing partnerships, DOE usually creates what it calls a teaming partner list. So you basically provide your organization name, a generic contact. It has to be like information at nasio.org or whatever. It can't be like Ed Carley at Nasio. It has to be a generic email address. And then sort of what you bring to the table. And so DOE publishes information on how to get to that teaming partner list with the funding opportunities. But it's a great way to get your name out there. Once you're on the list, other interested groups can contact you to join their proposal. If it sounds like a good match, and you can reach out to other organizations on the list to explore opportunities to work with them. Government entities like states and local governments will probably be popular as most of the funding opportunities actually require a government partner. So in other words, most projects can't move forward with just private companies or community-based organizations. They have to have a government partner. So shifting back to the application process, some DOE funding opportunities require a concept paper as a first step. They're usually fairly short, 2 to 4 pages, and you might have 30 to 40 days to write them. This is your first step in making a case for funding. It's helpful to have your partners lined up and that helps you start to get the formal sign off on letters of support. You don't have to have the full list at this point, but having solid partnerships is helpful. And I'm sure you all know it can be time consuming to get a sign off to be a part of a partnership on a formal letter. So the sooner you get those started, the better. So DOE then reviews concept papers. They issue an encouraged decision or not encouraged. You can continue to work on your application between that in that time frame between the encourage or discourage. I've seen project teams take both approaches. Kind of depends on your budget, your confidence, and your time availability. So concept papers are usually mandatory if they're required, and you won't be able to submit a full application if you miss it. They do this to try and help manage some of the burdens of applying for federal funding because it is a lot of time This way they can get ahead of things before you've invested a huge amount of effort. So then the next step is the full application. They include formal descriptions and plans for the project, your resumes, community benefits plans, things like that. So they have strict page limits and format requirements. In particular, if you've never applied for funding, you and your contract team should really get familiar with the federal budget forms because they're challenging. You also have to get a SAM number and cross some I's and dot some, or cross some T's and dot some I's to get registered. So once you submit, a group of experts from DOE and across the relevant industry begin to review the applications. At some point in that, once the reviewers are done, you'll get some comments back and you can reply to those within a pretty short time frame. So, I wanted to provide a word about reviewers and what they're looking for. So keep in mind that your reviewers are likely pretty time crunched. They're given specific guidance by DOE to not read anything that goes beyond the page limits. So if you send in additional pages, you might annoy your reviewers because they're essentially volunteers. There are some small honorariums, but really keep it tight and think about how your reviewer might approach your submission. So, the summary slide that you put together last might be the first thing the reviewer looks at. So there's important things like that. The reviewers also want to know how your project can make a big national impact. There are criteria laid out in all the funding opportunities, but it's really, they're going to look closely at what your project does to cut greenhouse gas emissions, fossil fuel use, increase the use of clean energy, and how feasible it is. And it's also really important to have a solid community engagement and benefits plan. This is part of the Justice 40 commitment that President Biden established. So that's really important. Work with your partners to have that ready to go. Make sure that your resumes and your project team really shows how you can achieve the goals that you've set out. They're going to take a close look at those resumes. And they also like to see how your project teams have worked together either before or have a good plan for how you plan to work forward to work together if the project is funded. So I think I'm running low on time. I will stop there, but I'm happy to take more questions. There's a lot of opportunity here and really set those partnerships up now. So that's my email, and I'll hand it back to Rajiv.
Thank you, Ed. We're going to drop our third poll question right now, and that's just talking about what has been your biggest hurdle to applying and managing a federal grant. Just take a second to respond to that poll, because as you guys are doing that, as Ed said, it's a lot of work going to just simply apply and execute these federal funds. I think, there are two words that come to mind from all of our presenters today, and that's collaboration and partnerships. Those are two critical pillars for any of these federal funding opportunities that cities and jurisdictions will go after. And now Sharon will go over that local perspective and how they've been planning that and how they're actually taking action on some of those federal funding opportunities. So I think we can move on to the next slide. Oh, looks like, all right, so we just got the poll results back, and our top answer is writing the grant proposal and completing the application. So that's not a surprising thing to hear. So appreciate everybody for taking the time to answer that poll. So again, now we're going to hear from Sharon with the City of Denver on how federal funding is intersecting with Denver's buildings and homes climate work. Floor is yours, Sharon.
Thanks, Rajiv. Greetings all. I'm going to talk about what Denver is working on to give you ideas you might consider pursuing. Next slide. In Denver, buildings and homes are 64% of our greenhouse gas emissions. We have committed to becoming carbon neutral by 2040, which means our existing buildings and homes need to be net zero energy by that time. Next slide. So we are in a much better position than most sustainability offices in the country, thanks to Denver voters. In November 2020, the voters approved a ballot initiative which created the Climate Protection Fund, which is funded by a 0.25% sales tax. This raises up to $40 million per year for our office, and the fund has these 6 allowable uses listed here. Next slide. We have 2 sources of funding for our BPS, our general fund and the Climate Protection Fund. The general fund gives us 5 positions, our administrative costs, and part of our vendor contract. The Climate Protection Fund fills in the gaps with 1 more position and pays for the rest of our vendor contract. We're trying to find funding for service gaps with our free compliance assistance programs for equity priority buildings. Next slide. So in the IIJA, as part of the Resilient and Efficient Codes implementation, we worked with our Colorado Energy Office to apply for funding for our energy codes and BPS work. Next slide. We have a Healthy Homes program that we are piloting this year to install heat pumps in low to moderate income homes where health issues have been identified. We applied to the Environmental Justice Government to Government program to scale up this program. And just last week, we found out that our senator had earmarked $2 million based on a few lines we had put in a master spreadsheet last year when the mayor's office asked for shovel-ready project ideas. So one thing to take away from today is to always have something ready to submit, even if it's just a few paragraphs, so that when you're ready, when those kinds of requests come around. Next slide. So we applied to the climate pollution reduction grants as part of our Regional Council of Governments, and we hope to get approval for that and hope to be part of implementation funding next year. Next slide. We applied to the ROI for the technical assistance funding for Zero Energy Code adoption, but haven't heard back on this one yet, so we will see what happens. Next slide. We are closely tracking the IRA tax incentives for residential heat pumps so that we can educate our citizens on how they could stack incentives and rebates to get their projects funded. This table shows examples on how a resident could combine Denver's rebates with utility incentives and then the possible IRA tax rebates. Next slide. And to wrap up, we are pursuing other funding sources for programs that aren't directly connected to our BPS, but our building owners are interested in, like electric vehicle charging stations and conservation block grant funding. We're very excited to be working with the state's new building decarbonization policy director to see where else we can align with the state on funding requests. I know that was super quick, but I wanted to make sure we had enough time for Q&A. So that's it for me for now, and I'll turn it back over to Rajiv.
Thank you, Sharon. We appreciate your courtesy for our audience. Looks like we still have some time to be able to take some questions. I'm going to drop in, or my colleagues behind the scenes will drop in our 4th and final poll. And it's just surveying our audience, and that is, what federal funding and programs are you most interested in? Between our speakers, Sharon, Maggie, and Ed, they went over a lot of them in their presentation today, but there are a couple new ones that have been announced, like last week. In here, we've got HUD's Green Resilient Retrofit Program. That one is in of particular interest to me to pass on to jurisdictions specifically for those owners of multifamily housing. So just take a second and fill that out. And then we'll get right into our Q&As. And if you've got more questions, please do keep dropping them in our Q&A section of the Zoom call. But I think we've got some already ready to go. This one I'm going to kind of throw out to the general, to most of our speakers. I might start with you, Ed. We've got somebody in the chat who asked, do you have any recommendations for first-time grant applications? I think you touched on this a little bit, but if this person has a little more specific they want to ask, please drop it in the chat. But to our speakers, what kind of recommendations would you give to first-time grant applicants in your experience?
So I would I'd come back to partnerships, like really focus on finding good partners. And you may want to find a partner who has applied before in the past. Otherwise, it's a lot to learn. And so there are organizations like IMT, Urban Sustainability Directors Network, that work with local governments and have some experience applying for federal funding. And get in touch with them, talk to other jurisdictions in your, if you're a local government, talk to other jurisdictions in your state or in your region, and see if you have some shared priorities that you can collaborate and pool your resources to apply for these opportunities. Also, those planning grants, I think, will be very helpful for getting ready. That's my thought. I don't know. Does anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I would add that some of the questions across some of the applications are very similar. So you can write up some pretty generic answers that apply to like a lot of different things, like about your BPS or about some of the climate action work that you're doing, that you could then just kind of plug into the application and just tweak a little bit based on the question. So the more you standardize some of those answers and have those ready to go, then what you're really putting together is what you want to do with that very specific money. And so that might be one way to help the time spent on like 10 different applications.
Yeah, nothing to add. I thought those are great suggestions. And, one other resource, as I already mentioned, was the technical assistance centers, the TICTACs for underserved communities. That might be another resource as those centers get stood up for resources and support on navigating that federal grant process.
Thank you, speakers. Tara, if you can, let's see the poll results from the federal funding entrance. So not one or taking over the other, but it looks like our top three seem to be RECI, the Resilient and Efficient Codes Implementation Grant, CPRG, and the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. I think there should be no surprise to our governmental partners that a lot of jurisdictions are really interested in figuring out how to go after this kind of funding and working with their on the ground CBOs. So thank you guys again. So we've got a couple more questions in the chat. I think we'll just take one or two, maybe one more question. I think looks like we've got one from Christy Miller. What is the best entry point for local school districts looking to build schools' energy efficiency and create living schoolyards?
So I'll jump in. So the Department of Energy has a program that was funded by the IIJA to provide, I think it was $250 million over 5 years for school energy efficiency and indoor air quality improvements. That, I think that the application period may have closed, but should open again for the next round of funding. So I think there was, sorry, it's a $500 million program. They released 80 million in the first tranche, and there should be another round of funding coming out definitely within the next 12 months. But you can use that. It is definitely targeted at very low resource school districts. But that's a great opportunity to get some funding. There's also the, I think it's the Energy Upgrade Prize that it looks like Maggie put a link in the chat too. Thank you, Maggie. But there's another prize that DOE has offered that supports energy managers in local schools. And that's a cool program too. It's, I think, informed a lot by a project out of Kentucky about 10 or 15 years ago, where they had shared energy managers that helped local districts to identify energy efficiency projects. They would do things like provide subject matter expertise on performance contracting and so on. So definitely there's actually an Energy Star case study. If you search for Kentucky School Energy Manager Program, an Energy Star, you should find it. It's also on the NASIA website, but I'll stop.
Thanks, Ed. Yes, great memory. I was looking up the DOE program as you were speaking, and you got everything spot on. I just dropped the link in the chat. And I was just going to add what you were jumping in there about kind of technical assistance, case studies, resources. EPA can definitely support on that. While we don't have a specific dedicated funding stream on schools like the DOE program, we do provide technical assistance, and the email address I provided earlier. And I'll drop that in the chat again. You can reach out to the EPA Energy Star team, and we can support you on technical assistance and best practices.
All right, well, I think we've just got 2 minutes left, so I think we're gonna close it for there, and we're gonna conclude today's webinar. So again, thank you to Maggie, thank you to Ed, thank you to Sharon for giving us your time and your expertise today on behalf of our audience. Again, to our audience members, thank you again for participating and continue to give us really good numbers for these webinars. You guys are showing us that this is the kind of information you are craving and you're wanting to learn more. So it's really valuable for us so we can better cater to your needs. So that said, we will send out a summary of the slides, and we will also share the recording. And I know a few of you said that you were interested in previous recordings, so we'll work with our team to make sure we have access to that. But just to end, thank you guys so much for participating today. And we look forward to talking to you again soon. Take care, everybody.